On State of the Water, we promise to bring impact players to you to talk about issues important to the communities, movers, shakers, and policymakers, things that impact the community. Well, today on our Community Impact Series, we're doing just that. Join us as we talk about the issues of gentrification here in the African American community. It's State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Claville. We'll be back in just a moment. Good morning. It's State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Claville. We want to thank you for joining us on this beautiful December Sunday morning. I don't know about you, but I feel Christmas in the air. You know, the holidays are here. The semester is over. Things are looking up, and it's a little crispy outside. Well, listen, we want to thank you also again for your support throughout the year. We're almost there. We're almost there to the end of 2022. If you look back and see where God has brought us, he's brought us from a mighty long way. We're thankful for all the great things that have happened and impacted us so positively here in our individual lives, collective lives, here on this campus, and just across this great city and commonwealth in our country and its world. But, as always, we couldn't do what we do without you. The support of you, the listeners, and also the Spartan Nations. Because, we broadcast live every Sunday from the best HBCU in the country. That's right. Home of the Spartan Nation, Norfolk State University. Home of the hottest radio station in the land. That's Hot 91, the soul of BAWNSB. And listen, I've had the pleasure from the very beginning of working with the hardest man in radio. That's right. That's Marvin Folks, also known as DJ Scandalous, which you can hear here on air live every day, Monday through Friday from 2 to 6 p.m., Saturdays, and yes, on Sunday, because he's here live with me. Marvin, how are you feeling at the end of this year, man?
It's a relief. It's a relief, man. It's been quite an interesting year, as you know. Thanks to my village and my family, and of course my Norfolk State family, I've been able to move on to pursue my PhD in computer science over at ODU, and it's been my first semester, so it's been kind of, it's been different, but it's a relief that like you said, the semester's over with and move on to the next one.
Absolutely. Well, it's only onward and upward from here, and I like to say that because it speaks at progress, right? And today, if you're not progressing, then what are you doing? You're just becoming stagnant. And today, we have a very important conversation that I want to have before the end of the new year. And this is part of our Community Impact Series. So listen, when we started State of the Water, I said that I would bring movers, shakers, and policymakers to you to discuss issues important to the community. And there's no other issue that's important to the community than where you live. Where you live. If you look across the years, some things have remained the same, but a lot has changed. And some people call it progress. Others call it gentrification. And some call it a loss of history. Well, we're going to unpack that today. And joining us, what we have with us is one of my favorite colleagues and a professor here at Norfolk State University. We have Dr. Colita Fairfax, professor of social work here at Norfolk State University and a faculty fellow of the Center for African American Public Policy. Dr. Fairfax, thank you for joining us here on State of the Water.
It is my honor, Doc, and good morning to Spartan Nation.
Absolutely. Look, we've known each other through the years, and I've known that you to be very active in the community, active in your organizations, and I think what a lot of people don't realize is that you're very active in the classroom. You're an impactful professor. You just don't teach. You just don't instruct, but you're impactful in the things that you do with your students.
I love my students, and listen. I tell my students that if a professor disciplines you, she loves you. He loves you. Discipline is how we show our love, so that they can grow intellectually and flourish. So it is indeed my honor and privilege to be with you as a mover and shaker yourself as we talk about this really important issue in our community.
So, look, let's dive right into it. You know, we're talking about the impact of displacement policies on our community. And to kind of get an overview of what we're talking about here, you know, I mentioned earlier in the show the word gentrification, right? And some people see it as progress, right? And some people see it as destruction of a community and loss of history. Before we get into the research that you've done along with several other professors here, tell us a little bit about what is gentrification?
Simply put, gentrification is the development of newer and more expensive housing stock upon the decimation of aging housing stock or housing stock that is considered to be undesirable. And so gentrification or regentrification tends to take over spaces where vulnerable people have lived and thrived in many cases, many families, for decades and decades. And we find this situation occurring over and over again in cities across America.
Well, you know, I'm going to play devil's advocate here and look at the other side of that. Some people say, you know, these homes have been up here for 75 years. They're dilapidated and we need an upgrade here. I mean, isn't this a good thing?
I think that depends upon whose house you're talking about and whether or not you live in that house that your great uncle built or that a great grandparent built, and it may be aging, but there's family history there. There's home. There's a sense of history and genealogy there. It would be novel, right, if cities had budgets to assist homeowners with aging housing stock development. So we don't see a policy for that. What we do see, however, in the case of Norfolk, my hometown, Richmond, Hampton, Martinsville, we see local governments simply decimating those homes. And in the case of Norfolk, projects, government project housing, which was developed upon decimating older traditional black communities, neighborhoods, in order to beautify, if you will, spaces. And again, the beautification comes at a much higher cost, at a much higher price, pricing lower income, working income black families. So it from my perspective as an Africana studies scholar, it always happens on the backs of black people, not people of color, but black people, our community. And I think that's a very important question. I think it's a very important observation. Why does it always happen on the backs of black people?
Wow.
Even when the community lobbies to locality governments, it doesn't matter. Big money will win. Profit over people will win. And that's a huge problem that I think we need to be honest about.
Wow. You know, it's interesting when you start talking about that. What comes to mind are two instances in major cities that I saw the transformation over the last really 20 years. I'll never forget, I went to D.C. in 2000 as a student. I was there for a conference and did some study there for that particular summer. And I remember like walking from the dormitory, and you would walk down the street and you'll see an embassy, and then like 3 doors down you'll see, you know, a dilapidated home, people chilling on the stoop, you know, all kinds of stuff going on. And then you get to university and I'm like, okay, this is like a big mixture of the community, right? What DC is. Go back now 20 years later. I mean, you see high-rise apartments. You see these homes that have been fixed up and sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, where really $100,000 could have bought that home or less back, 20 years ago. And one other thing you see is that a lot of the students now and people, that own businesses in the area. They're saying, wait a minute, our community is being taken away from us. Tell us about the perspective of, you talk about at the objection of the community. What have you seen in your research and your dealings and talks with the community? How do they feel about the changing of their community?
Yeah, I appreciate that, because when we're talking about communities, I think we should be clear. There's a difference between community and then neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are residential areas where we live. I'm quoting Dr. Claude Anderson. Communities also include an infrastructure, meaning a network of economic businesses, institutions, facilities, organizational work. In the case of Norfolk, we're talking about Titustown, for example, Lambert's Point, Berkeley, Church Street communities, Princess Anne Road, Oakwood. These were community enclaves where there were businesses and neighborhoods. The community always responded viscerally to the impact of urban renewal, or what many scholars may call Negro removal. The community responded in ways where they built infrastructure. There were businesses, and there were service agencies, and there were community development credit unions, street improvements, economic cooperatives, church agencies, spiritual renewal activities, socialization rituals. And all of this has been in response to, within the last 50 years, locality governments rescinding the Economic Opportunity Act of 1965, which was meant to provide funding for job training, adult education, community action agencies, and community action programs with maximum feasible participation, loans to small businesses to attack the roots of employment and poverty. But yet, when successive generations of presidents, such as Ford and Reagan and Clinton and Bush, turned the Economic Opportunity Act into a community services administration, then we see a very different way in which economic development became minuscule, and especially with the development of the Community Development Block Grant under President Clinton, which was created to provide funding for physical city infrastructure, which has primarily been used for that, such as affixing stoplights, streets, parks, playgrounds, and yes, low-income housing. But we don't find economic community development. And I even teach my students at NSU, listen, there's a difference between economic community development and services. People tend to conflate services and outreach with community economic development. And no, they're separate things. Community economic development means the development of an economic infrastructure that serves the community feeds into it, and it's not services and outreach, which we typically find cities doing. So, for example, in the city of Norfolk, there's the Norfolk Community Services Board, right? There's the Office to End Homelessness. There's the Public Health Department. There's the Human Services Department. Those, yes, are important, but those are not community development entities. And we need to be clear about the difference.
It's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, here doing our Community Impact Series. We're engaging and talking with one of our professors here at Norfolk State University, Dr. Colita Fairfax, and delving into the impact of displaced communities, the issue of gentrification in our community. Dr. Fairfax, you mentioned Negro removal, right? And of course, the term that's used is gentrification, but when you talk about the community and when you talk about the eroding of public policies created to protect these communities and African Americans, we see that this impacts for the most part, Black people. Why do you believe that this type of impacts African Americans? And when I say this, I'm not talking about, hey, we get new stores, we get new businesses, we get new roads and so forth. But every community gets that. But it's only when we look at these communities that the African Americans are then removed or priced out of these communities and not able to stay. What does your research say about that?
Well, my research showed, and I've been working on this given that I was able to get a grant through CAAmPP during the pandemic, looking at the City of Norfolk budget books. and examining the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 for the last 2 years, is that it really is predatory. There's no other way to say it, that cities such as Norfolk and other cities have just simply continued predatory behavior toward Black people, and particularly impoverished Black people. When city governments are looking at their budgets and they're looking at ways to strengthen the tax base, from my judgment, the only option that they tend to employ is quote unquote economic development. So there's not the creativity with cultural economic development, right? With other ways to develop spaces and properties and what we offer our people. Big business will win. Big money will win, and it's predatory. And if we look at Norfolk, for example, throughout the last 100 and some years, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexandra has discussed and written about this, we see the predatory behavior upon Black neighborhoods when it's time to quote unquote develop. The growth of our transportation highway infrastructure was on the backs of Black neighborhoods. Black neighborhoods were obliterated to Bill 64, 264, 664, 464. So it really is racial predatory behavior. And what happens is that when it's spun in the newsreel, it is these neighborhoods are a scourge. This is going to assist people by providing better upgraded housing. And that really, it doesn't happen because people lose their homes. They lose years of investments in their homes. They lose their businesses. And when you lose a business, it is difficult when you relocate to recoup your customer base, to recoup your ability to build that business. So we see a wealth gap here because of racial predatory behavior of locality governments. But what I think is really important to note is that the community has always engaged in resistance. We have always engaged in being functional, and even today we find schools such as the Ready Academy in Norfolk, the Faith Academy in Norfolk. We find cultural institutions. We find agribusinesses. There's a way in which we understand self-care is really community care, Dr. Claville. So I think it's important that we just call the dog what it is. It's racial predatory behavior of locality governments, and it's a way to cater to big business. Big business will win each and every time. And I think as a community, we need to be completely clear about that. Yet we also need to know our history, and we need to follow the patterns of our history. We need to support social businesses. We need to find ways to provide health care that we can provide in the community. We need to support our cultural businesses, such as the Addicts Theater and our own libraries. We need to support our agribusinesses, manufacturing, and markets. We need to find ways to further support our ancillary organizations who do the important lifting, such as our Masons and Odd Fellows, Eastern Stars, our sororities and fraternities. We have churches also doing the heavy lifting. We just simply, some of us don't lean in and turn our eyeballs inward to really pay attention to the work that's being done in community.
You know, when you talk about that type of work being done in the communities, I want you to take just a few years back. You know, one of our long-term fighters for the community, Councilman Paul Riddick, who's actually retired at the end of this year, stepping from the council. He didn't run for re-election, but he fought, for these communities, especially Tidewater Gardens, Tidewater Park, Calvert Square, Young Terrace. He fought for these communities, but like you said, big business won out. Tell us what is going to happen. Well, tell us, first of all, our listeners, take us back in history, what happened to Tidewater Gardens as relates to the mall being built, and tell us what's getting ready to happen with these other communities where really we're looking at the largest displacement of African Americans in the country.
So when locality government decides to displace a group of people, I have a colleague who calls that racial cleansing. And it is violent, it's forcible, and it really speaks of this sense of not valuing a particular group of people, with under the guise of we're moving them to a better location, we're moving them to a better place. We are really disrupting relationships. We're disrupting people's ability to access their churches. We're disrupting kinship. I think we should see the larger impact of people psychologically. There are elders who can still talk about how they were impacted, how their families and their neighborhoods were impacted when the government project housing were built in the 50s and 60s, obliterating people's homes. People own those homes, obliterating the economic infrastructure, obliterating, right, or diminishing the power of the economic Church Street corridor, for example. That is a very powerful memory for generations. And so, yes, that's trauma. I think we should call that for what it is. But what I don't want missed by our listening audience is that the community, they'll continue to engage in building, in transforming, in attending to who we are, and in saving who we are. I think that we need to not only see our communities as repositories of history, but our communities are also repositories of culture, of wealth, of income, of businesses, of security. It's not by accident that Family Dollar will build in our community. Why? Because they see that people will support it. They see economics there. So I think we should not decide that, there's no money in impoverished communities. Oh, yes, there is, because McDonald's will build there, Burger King will build there, Family Dollar will build there,
right.
a Stop and Go will build there. We as a people must change how we view and envision ourselves, but also how we get to work. And when we talk about self-care, that's community care. When we talk about what do we need to do to build our people, you talk about the brothers hanging out on the corner, it is because partially they have been thrown away by the system, but we need to have institutions of healing, human development, family development, present, working together to advance ourselves. We need to apply African principles and spiritual principles in paradigms to develop our people, to organize strategically, and to intervene, knowing that national and local public policy specific to our community will and have been damaging. I believe these are important conversations we should continue to have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one thing I want to talk about, and one thing I love to do, is that we not only raise important issues important to the community, and they're vital, but we talk about solutions, right? Because ultimately, whatever problems are out there, there is a solution to that problem. So if we're still fighting this fight, right, and we're losing the big business, big money, you also mentioned something very vital, that, you know, we still have vibrant communities. What is the solution to preserving the communities in which we live, preserving the culture that we built, the proud culture, the rich culture? You know, what is the solution to that?
Well, I do think we need to have much more impactful discussions with our city manager, the staff there, and city council. Because as I evaluate city budgets, and that was my first research grant with CAAmPP, to engage in a budget cost analysis, the police department budget goes up every year. Dr. Claville, I'm driving to campus to class last month. I'm on Tidewater Drive, which is one of the major arteries in the city, and a big tanker passes by me with police officers. And I think I had such a look of horror on my face because I was so surprised to see this. I thought, okay, maybe there's a movie being shot. And they're waving at me because I think they see how perplexed my face is. Why in a city do we see that unless there's a war going on somewhere in the city? So we need to challenge locality government about their budgetary choices. And my late pastor made a statement that I'll never forget. Budgets are moral documents. So you spend every year, you spend more for the police department. And I believe the police department outfunds every department in the city of Norfolk. And Norfolk is not alone. But you don't put that kind of investment in community development. The investment in parks, recreation, and culture is not equal. The investment in public health and assistance is not equal. The investment in serious development of business owners, we simply don't see that. And so I think that's a dialogue we should have. But we also need to have a dialogue in our community about resistance and what resistance looks like to restore sacred spaces, to restore the teaching of culture, the development of businesses within families, and what then that looks like as we develop community. I do hope we can have part two. I know our time is up. I do hope we can have part two of this conversation. I do.
Absolutely. The impact of displacing our communities, the issue, the history, and the solution. You've been listening to Dr. Colita Fairfax, professor of social work here at Norfolk State University and faculty fellow for the Center for African American Public Policy. Listen, this is not just a topic for today, but this is a topic for every day. And I, for one, really appreciate the work that you do and the research that you've done and also the work you do in your organization and the community. I mean, you're out there, you're preserving the history, you are an advocate and a voice, not just for your students, but for our people. And I appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Doc. It was my pleasure. And you too are a heavyweight. It's my honor to work with you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Absolutely. All right. God bless.
God bless.
Well, that's our Community Impact Series, talking about issues that are important to the community, bringing movers and shakers and policymakers. We have a rich culture, a culture like no other, a culture built out of adversity, a culture built out of success, triumphs, and no matter what, we're still here. We're still standing. So just like every Sunday, we want to thank you for joining us here on Stay the Water. Join us again this Sunday coming up. It's Christmas as we discuss Christmas in our community. As always, be blessed, be great, and we'll see you next week.